Hello and welcome to Making Revenue Tech. I'm delighted to be joined by Bradley. Hello, Bradley.
Hello, Ethan. How are you?
I'm wonderful. Thank you so much for joining me. I know that when we had an initial conversation prior to you going on to our other podcast to tell your career story, we spoke about one of the things that you've done a lot in your career, which is about taking international brands into America. And we came up with this topic, which is mastering the American market without making an ass of it, because there's lots of mistakes to be made and to be avoided. So before we get into that then, Bradley, could you tell everyone who doesn't already have the pleasure of knowing you a bit about yourself and why this is a topic close to your heart?
Sure. So a little bit about me. So I've been in revenue leading roles for probably the past 15 plus years. Prior to that, even when I was not in revenue leading roles, I worked in a variety of individual contributor and alliance and business development. And a large chunk of my career has been working for international companies that have had US presence, whether there have been European-based companies or companies in the Pacific Rim, those areas. So having gone through multiple iterations of those companies, I've had firsthand seat and view of really what's been successful and what's not been successful in doing that.
Sure. Okay, perfect. And then, so if this is kind of like a guide for startups to actually expand successfully into the US, from your experience, what are the sort of people that are probably going to be tuning in and watching this episode today?
A lot of what I'm seeing these days, which is a little bit different probably from what I saw 10 plus years ago. 10 plus years ago was large corporations that had just a US presence, and that's what they do. What I'm seeing more of these days is a large chunk of founder-led, typically venture-backed companies that are looking to expand into the United States.
Sure.
So they have large engineering presence in some parts of Europe, a lot of times in Israel, for example, Ireland, and they've determined through investors or otherwise that the path to revenue is through North America.
Sure.
And someone has said, you need to go east and build a presence, or go west, depending upon which direction they're coming from. And that's where they are, right? So it is a timely topic when people are looking at how do we have smart revenue growth, and how do we define that? And also, how do you go and find a large marketplace and market opportunity, which is the United States?
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of like, obviously the American dream was incredibly famous, but certainly the rest of the world dream is to make America a success. Every
Right.
band tries to do it. And it's the same with every business. We look at, as an English person, we look at that market and go, there's 330 million people. It's the largest economy in the world. Surely we can make it there. We speak the same language, but it's just
Right.
not. It's not that simple, unfortunately.
Absolutely.
Luckily, there are people like you to help. So within those, founder-led VC-backed type businesses, who are the sorts of people within those ecosystems that you think have a particular stake in understanding a topic like this? Who's going to be tuning into this episode?
I would say it needs to start, well, if you think you need to find what's good and what's success. And that's going to be viewed through the lens of who's helping you define what's good and what's success. So from an investor point of view, they're looking at ultimately what investors care about. It's return on the capital, right? So we're making investment in, what are we going to get out of it? And certainly everyone's seen a lot of the news around money's not as cheap and free and easy as it is now. However, if you're receiving some money or you have money available now, part of what you need to do is how are you going to expand and find more market opportunities? And that's going to be the United States, right?
Sure.
So even if you're not getting lots of money, the question still comes down to how are you going to get it? So if I'm an investor, what are you doing with my money? Or how are you going to maximize the money you have now?
Sure.
If I'm a CEO or founder, part of it's going to be how do I grow and expand my company? So I would look at it as really, it's investors, it's the founders / CEOs. And I would also look at it in terms of who are the people who are going to own this challenge, problem, opportunity. And that's really going to be largely your sales leaders.
Sure. Okay, fantastic. I know that I was really excited to record this with you because I actually in 2017, hence the Dolphins helmet, was flown over to America on an E.32 visa when we bought a business in Fort Lauderdale, and then the goal was to take it from like a 30-person business to a 100-person business, and I was the man sort of leading that charge, and I made loads of mistakes. and had a load of assumptions that didn't turn out to be true. So I wish I'd had the access to someone like you and this podcast before I did it. So hopefully there'll be people like me a few years ago who can learn from this experience. I think what will be really good is if we talk about those intricacies, and we'll talk about some of the successful examples of strategies that you've known has actually worked, and of course the pitfalls to avoid as well. But let's talk about the why. So obviously it's a massive market, biggest in the world, huge population, same language as the rest of the world speaks largely. Why do you think this is such an attractive call for people? Why is making successful expansion into America such a fantastic goal that most businesses aim for?
It's, if you think in largest, there's what's your TAM, right? What's your addressable market? And inside there, you can break it out into serviceable and ICT and all these other things. But for most organizations, their eyes either large corporate entities in the United States or the largest part of that company is in the United States. So you could certainly look and say, Jaguar Land Rover is owned by Tata. Okay, fine. So we're going to go and focus on India. However, the overall Indian market is still going to be small on the basis of that. So BMW is certainly Germany, but BMW North America you're going to focus on. If you're focusing and selling on anything to do with high tech, most of those companies are going to be based in the United States. So you're going to have a handful of security companies based in Israel. You're going to have a couple other fintechs here or there, but the United States is where you're going to be. So you get a combination of things. You get a combination of diversity of marketplace. So I can go and I can look and say it's not just banking. It's also manufacturing. It's high tech. It's healthcare. It's state and local government, et cetera, et cetera. And you can expand it there. You get a diversity of time zones and opportunities. That's both positive and negative. So if, I said earlier, if you're going east, if you're a Japanese-based company, you have the opportunity to work West Coast and work inside there. If you are a company that really wants to focus on also getting access to more capital market, so you believe that by expanding, you have the opportunity to raise more capital. Certainly the United States, with both its private equity and venture back, is the area to go to it. So I really say that most companies and most people look at it and say, there's a multitude of opportunities and they downplay the risks in terms of coming to the United States. They say, well, we sell in Luxembourg, or we sell in South Africa, or we sell in India. So therefore, coming to the United States isn't a big deal. We can come over once or twice a year. Our founders can come here. We can leverage our relationships, and it's just magically going to happen, right? And what usually happens is that it magically doesn't happen.
Sure. Okay, makes sense. We'll talk about those pitfalls and the common reasons why in just a moment. How do you see the trade-off between this being the sort of personal ambition of the founder or the CEO versus maybe more of the board directive and where the VC is looking to steer that company to achieve its ROI?
Candidly, since that's the conversation, I think it's really more around the former. I think it's the CEO, and we're going to go and we're going to build that market. And we were talking in terms of the prep about musicians. So if you're number one on the charts in Denmark, right? Like, okay, great, you're big in Denmark, but you want to be number one in US,
Sure.
Right? And you could be a millionaire selling all of your music over again in Denmark, nothing against Denmark, but you want to be a multimillionaire in terms of selling in the United States, right? And people look in terms of who's best in terms of global brand. Really, people don't focus on that. So my experience with investors is, again, it's maximizing the opportunity. If you're maximizing the capital return and you're doing it in your region and you're doing it in a capital efficient way and you're having the growth, okay, awesome, good for you, right? And there's tons of companies that do that. So I do believe it's one of these things where, envy, it's one of the sins. So they look at it and say, well, I want to go there and I want to create it and I want to make it bigger and I want to be able to say, I cracked that market. Sure. And you see it time and time again, where companies are very successful in the regions they are and very successful in the countries they are. And they say, because we're successful, we now want to go and we want to crack the US market. And They believe that, and we'll get into this, but they believe that the motions that they did and made them successful there will translate over, and the cost structures that they have will translate over. And typically they fail on both. And I believe that is not an investment decision. I believe that is a we think there's greener opportunities and we're going to go for it rather than really focusing on how can they expand effectively where they are.
Yeah, it makes total sense. And you got, I mean, like these founders, right? They're not building lifestyle businesses. We're talking about tech founders with massive ambitions, and it's like their baby. Why would you want to have any sort of idea that your baby would have a limitation in terms of the potential that they could achieve? And like you say, if they're being really successful in a different economy, which they might see as more complex, you know, let's say someone's been successful in EMEA, multiple languages, you know, multiple cultures, with some naivety, you could easily look at the US and say, well, it's a much more simple market to crack. So surely we can do it there. I think that would definitely exist if you spoke to a few EMEA leaders, because the reverse perception of that is if you're a European based team and you've got an American HQ or American, you know, big founding board, then they would see the same sort of naivety around the complexities of Europe. And we often see that people, you know, have the same strategies that they're using into America, into the UK, Germany, Sweden, France, Italy, which are very different in terms of the way that you would approach the market, sell to the market. You know, the messaging, everything is different. Certainly the rules of engagement and what is deemed as polite, acceptable, and, you know, welcome completely changes. And I think that there's a naivety internationally that America doesn't have those same level of complications and differences and nuances, which is just plain wrong. And you know better than most of what those things are. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about some of the sort of nuances and adaptations that the US has that maybe some of the international people watching this might not know about instinctively.
Right. So, I mean, certainly you spend time in Miami, you touched on that, but Miami is not Florida, right?
No.
So you can travel all over Florida. You can go from the Panhandle, where the state capital is, and you can go down to the Keys. It's an entirely different world down there. And so part of the nuance is trying to figure out, you know, where do we go? Where are we going to set up shop? Where are we going to do headquarters? And then what are those exact specific cultural nuances? And what I caution people, if you think about Europe and travel inside of Europe, especially, and you think of something like Boston to Chicago, that is, in terms of distance and direction, you know, that's half of continental Europe. And I think that people don't think of it that way.
Yeah.
And the same is flipped around, which is US companies look and say, oh, Europe is so scary. But we view it as Europe is so scary because independent of the EU, it's still a multitude of different countries, multitude of different cultures. And to your point, people look at the US and say, oh, it's just the US. But it's not. So a couple of things that I would look at in terms of caution, how you can build up. This podcast is not tax advice and cost advice, but first of all, it's expensive, right? So there is a cost of labor that's going to be significantly higher in the United States. There are cultural differences in terms of how setting aside the actual comp and what you pay people, structures, benefits, all of those things, which are very different than what you're going to find in most European countries inside there. So I think a mistake that a lot of companies have made is that they view that the structure that they have is going to be easy and replicable to go, hey, we're going to pick it up, we're going to plop it here in the United States.
Sure.
So you find a lot of organizations where we don't have human resources, we don't have functions like that here in the States. But from a state perspective, because if you're in Massachusetts, the state laws are going to be different than New Hampshire, than Vermont. They made all these different things through it. So you really have to look at it and say that the U.S. is made up of almost 50 little countries inside of it. And it's easy to say, well, we're going to go ahead, and I'll give you, for example, we're going to go and just build an office in Boston. Okay, great. Again, not tax advice, but if you're flying people around the country, there is a scenario where if you're spending time working in those different states, those states could, for example, charge you for tax, right? Like I could have to pay tax if I spend too much time. So there's tiny little weird things like that on first glance of it don't seem like that big of a deal that you're going to say, well, all right, we're going to go ahead and roll out a team and it's just going to go ahead and we're going to hire a bunch of people. But there's not. Culturally, the people in Boston are also going to be different than potentially the people in New York, the people in Chicago, the people in Florida. They're going to be different in terms of educational backgrounds. They're going to be different in terms of even, I wouldn't say their native language, but it's really surprising people who don't come to the United States, the difference just in terms of accents. If you go from someone to New York, to Chicago, to Florida, to Texas, to California. So there's like these tiny little things that are not make or break, but people assume, oh, we're going to go to the US and everyone in the US is going to be exactly the same around there. And it's not. The other small aspect of that is the public transportation infrastructure in the United States is nowhere near as well established as in Europe. So simple things such as commuting. People can't come in and commute, or people have very long commutes, or generationally, you're going to get a layer of people that are going to say, we're just going to fundamentally work from home and we're not going to come in. So I've had both. I worked for one company that was based out of Asia where there was no office in the United States. Everyone was 100% virtual. And I went and spent time with my boss and stayed at his house. And that was just what we did. And then I've worked for companies that are based out of the UK where we had, and I think it had to do with just English culture. We have the office and we have the admin and we have this and formality. It was very well structured and very put in place. So there's definitely differences between how all those things are structured and how all those are set up. And what I would caution people is you're almost going to have to replicate what you have in Europe in terms of office and structure and support in the US. Or conversely, what I advise people in the US to do when we go to Europe is to go the partner route. So avoid building a team here in the US, find partners to work with and go there. And for some reason, to finish the thought, US companies understand when they go to Europe, they should build out a partner channel and structure. And I think it's because they're concerned about the tax structure. They're concerned about localities. They're concerned about a Spanish person showing up in Germany. And for whatever reason, they go, oh, no, we can't do that. We need a German selling in Germany. But that same thought's not put in place into the United States. That probably maybe what we should do in the US is let's work with a couple partners in the US. Figure out if we can define that distribution channel, figure out if we can define who our customers are, figuring out who we can figure out who those relationships are, and then getting back to the original point, defining what is good and what is success. We put in place those metrics. And when those metrics are achieved, then we go and we bring the crew over and we establish a beachhead here in the United States. Something you and I've talked a lot about is the rise of advisors and fractional. There's a whole boatload of people who were fractional salespeople through services like Bravado. There's fractional executives. So you could easily build a sales channel that handles all your accounting through a partner. And you could find a variety of fractional people to do your work. And you could argue that they're not as 100% committed, but I would make the opposite argument that says, are you 100% committed as a company to put millions of dollars and wait a year on that return? I would say no, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a massive bet, isn't it? I was listening to Tom Glasson from Pavilion talking about his strategy for breaking into American before, and they've got a method at scale-wise around doing this, where you bet a certain amount of it's from Crossing the Chasm, actually, one of the books I've got here, but you bet a certain amount of your revenue into new markets. It's very, very small, it's like 3%. And so you wouldn't replicate your entire cost center because it's such a big thing to have a cost center when you go, oh, surely we could just tap into this new market, but it doesn't really work. And I was part of a project, which is acquiring a company called the Channel Company in the US. And then we took them over and then moved them and then grew it with some of the sort of US based management and leadership team. And then some expats like me flowed over to try and bring in some of the DNA, and inject that culture into the business. And it was successful, but we made a lot of mistakes. And then you've talked about potentially partnering. I think that one of the things that Tom found that worked really well for him was that he actually built a US team in England with US people working US hours and got that up to a certain level of productivity, really successful. And then actually that team moved into the US. What are some of the different ways you've seen it happen? So you've got partnering, you've got building a replica of your existing org that's been successful. What other options might people have you seen that have worked?
A bunch of years ago, I had the opportunity to be employee one for an Israeli startup, and that was going to be what's called a 1099, an independent contractor, right? So I passed on at that time because things such as healthcare and benefits. And again, in the US, that's really not provided by the government. It's very difficult to go ahead and find it. So while the opportunity is very compelling, and in retrospect, I probably should have taken it because the company did quite well. There were infrastructure things that where I was at my place in life would have been very challenging to go ahead and do. And maybe someone else could have said, all right, we're going to take it on. But I would say, yeah, be open and flexible around what's the structure you're thinking of. So we're going to build a pod out of our corporate offices. We're going to use technology to replicate local phone calls. We're going to make sure that the people in accents aren't a big deal because most major cities have an influx of people outside the country. They have an influx of students. So I've found in my conversations that people don't look at it and say, oh, I have an English accent or a Spanish accent or something on the phone. They don't look at it and say, you're not calling from the United States, right? It's again, we're not a monolith. So if you're building a pod and replicating it out, that's only one strategy in terms of it. Partners strategy. Building out a team here in the US is a strategy in terms of doing that. Not going into the market. So not doing something is still an option from that perspective. But I think any of those times that you're going to go ahead and build that structure out and focus on it and say, we're going to go and do it, you need to also identify what are the core components of it. So usually it's going to be a salesperson. Usually it's going to be some sort of solution engineer around there. Yeah. And it's going to be at a minimum some level of customer success person. And that structure, Richard, might be different and heavier than what you have in where your main corporate relationships are, because you're asking people to do more in the United States. The other part of that is how you're going to handle things such as support, finance, etc. So if you're, think of something like your company's based in Australia, depending upon your times in the United States, you may have 1 hour a day where there's overlap in terms of work. So who's going to be providing your support? Who's going to be handling all that? So if you don't have that infrastructure in place to be able to handle setting up those customers, immediately you're setting it up for failure. And that failure is owned at the corporate level. It's not owned at the team that you have in the United States.
Yeah.
Right. So again, thinking about what sort of structure you make inside there, if you're going to have to invest a little bit heavier, if you're going to send people here or you're going to hire people here to build that out. And then I think there's other aspects of it, which is you're asking people to make commitments. So I would look at being a little bit more generous around things such as severance, potentially either guaranteeing or building better ramps in terms of compensation. And then as it relates to compensation, I would focus less in terms of actual dollar for comp, and I would focus on milestones and metrics. So for the sales leader, it could be hiring, it could be, I don't like meetings as a metric, but there could be expectations around there. We're going to build up a partner channel. We're going to do this. For salespeople, it could be purely new logo acquisition, right? And I would lean less on churn as a metric. Because for the example, if you're an Australia-based company and you have 1 hour a day of working time to provide support, are you going to hold that one person accountable in the United States for support that could be taking 2 days to even get a ticket resolved? Wow. And then as a CEO or whoever it is, you need to have alignment across your leadership team to make sure it's not that the US team is some sacred cow that can't be slaughtered. It's that you're looking and you're saying, this is why we are doing this, right? As opposed to we're holding it out. And then when the people you bring on board, you're having an open, honest conversation to say, we're building this plan out for this year. Yeah. And then once these milestones are met, we're going to reevaluate it. So you're going to look and say, year 2, we're going to shift to more of a normal traditional compensation model. Heading out of year 2 and year 3, we're going to shift and we're going to look and say the US team's going to be measured on churn, right? And we're going to have that built into it. So it becomes very difficult to go and say, we're going to build out a different cost structure with different targets, with different measurements. And we're going to be okay with that because that's not the way that operationally most of us are wired. Right?
Yeah, sure. And you're absolutely right. It's such a big commitment. And like you said, it has to be a two-way commitment. If you're hiring people to make America a success and make that expansion a success, you need proven people, right?
Right.
And they're going to cost more. Yes. And you're probably a more risky bet. What do you mean I won't have all this thing in place, but the promise is so much higher. So you have to pay more for that. So the idea is that you can absolutely hire some fantastic salespeople if you pay them well, but the sales leadership element might be much more expensive if you're going to get that top tier. So what you said around fractional, I think is brilliant, because you can get, for the price of probably one, a few different disciplines, maybe the COO, CMO, CRO, on a fractional basis that gives you an incredible amount of experience and leadership capability to actually go make sure you've got the right people management structures in place and you're approaching it the right way, but also your sales and marketing engine is going to be set up the right way to actually work in the US, which is a different type of motion than it is in EMEA. So if we talk about that, and obviously you're a chief revenue officer, right? So you sit across sales and marketing and everything else that drives revenue. How do you think that the most important differences in terms of setting up sales and marketing for success in America looks like than what it does from international organizations?
The easy flip answer is you set them up, you leave them alone. But that's not helpful to people who are listening to this. There are some things, this is where part of it becomes expensive in terms of time and energy. So issues such as GDPR, it's a different conversation here in the US. We have it again, really more at the state level, right? So this is not about guidance of what you should or shouldn't do, and don't take it as of how you're going to build out and manage your contacts. But again, different states have different requirements. So if you're marketing and doing outreach into California, what you're going to do in terms of requirements is going to be different than other states inside there. So what I would do, and the way that I would approach it is, I would, similar to staff, similar to budget, is I would almost call out a separate instance around how I do my marketing in the US than I do in the rest of the world, at least initially, right? So you don't run into conflicts around data. You don't run into conflicts around what the US team wants to do versus what your EMEA or Asia Pac, et cetera, team wants to do.
Sure.
And that's going to be not expensive in terms of money, because it's the same platform, right? So you get a Salesforce license, you get a HubSpot license, whatever. It's not that big of a deal, but you're going to make sure that your ops people, and you should have ops people, have the ability and technical aptitude to do that. So I would build out almost a duplicative structure of what you have in wherever your corporate headquarters is in the US, and keep that separate and almost walled off from the rest of the world inside there. So that means your Salesforce data, means your reporting. I would view and slice out the cost of sales and across those channels in the US. And when I mean channel, I don't mean like partner channel. I mean, we have a direct channel, we have a marketing channel. View that as a separate cut than what you do everything else. And then maybe when you do board reporting, you can aggregate and you put it all together. But comparing activity that happens in the US to the rest of the world, you're automatically starting off at a bit of a disadvantage inside there, and there's challenges. So I would go set up a separate either Salesforce instance or have that separate. I would have all your marketing, your HubSpot be separate from there. And these things sound really expensive initially going on, but I also like to plan for the worst case scenario, which is we're going to shut down the US. So if you need to shut down the US, if all that is separate, it becomes much easier to pull out that data and worry about data quality and integrity and compliance than if everything is all interrelated, right? And that's going to get down to territory planning. It's going to get down to, we mentioned BMW and Tata in the beginning. Who owns BMW, right? It's a reasonable question. And when you think about acquisitions and mergers, and I had a company way back in the day that we were selling into that was pharmaceutical company, Aventis, right? And Aventis merged with another company. And you think of an extreme scenario, if you have a go-to-market team in the US who's working on a US company that gets acquired by a European company, who owns that? And people say that we can figure these things out downstream, but I would say you can't. And the reason why you can't is you're going to create animosity and stress and challenges within the organization if you don't figure out those things going forward, right? So if you don't have segmented out, if you don't have territory plans set out, if you don't have named accounts set up, and I'm a big proponent of named accounts versus geo, and we can get into reasons why, but that would be the way that I would approach it, so that there are no questions, around what's the data, what's the structure, what's the quality, what's the cohorts we're looking at, how do we define cost of sales, how do we define our lifetime value, and so you can look at it separate in and of itself. So if the US market in where you are might be growing lower, but it is exceeding the expectations, but that might be lower than the rest of the world, right? Inside there.
Sure.
A friend of mine shared me a story where they were with a company for 6 months. He was VP of marketing inside there, and then they're coming back from a business meeting, and the corporate entity called them and said, "We're shutting down the US. You have a month to wind it all down."
Mm-hmm.
They were hitting all the expectations, hitting all the metrics, revenue was on target, but they were just, we're done. We're not going to do it anymore, right? The angst, the investment, all those things, though there was a return, it wasn't moving as fast. And they felt that the deals and the relationships and what they were doing on the US was sort of looser and running a little bit faster and quicker. And culturally, they would have liked as a company. Right? So even then, you can do everything correct. But if it isn't culturally aligned as well, you might end up on the wrong side of the equation.
Yeah, sure. A lot to unpack there, but I think that anyone that listening would hate me if I didn't ask why you have a bias for a named account strategy.
So I believe that the best way to measure people is to make it really clear about what the expectations are.
Sure.
And most companies that either I've worked for or done advising from will tell you they have an ICP, but they don't have an ICP, right? So they have a list, and here's our list, and here's everyone in it. And our ICP is everyone, right? We sell to finance. Yay, it's everyone. And you go, well, is that credit unions? Is it banks? Is it capital markets? Is it asset management? Is it investment banks? And they go, I don't know, right? It's JP Morgan, right? Well, that doesn't help. So if you're going to go and keep track of both marketing activity, and I believe marketing should not be measured on things like MQL, marketing should be measured on pipeline. Right. That is the ultimate indicator of the health of the business.
Yeah.
So the best way to do that, I think, is named accounts. So I know that my team has 50 named accounts they're supposed to go into. So I can either do account-based marketing there. I can focus on named account approach by having, if you are a fan of the SDR model, I can have people focus on that. For sales reps, it's very easy to go through and say, what's your named account should mirror your ICP, but inside there, who are the personas? So I can make sure that our product marketing team has content and collateral that aligns with our ICP and our personas. We can do that outreach. We can then learn what our best practices and what resonates across them. So if you're using any sort of analytics type tool like a Gong to listen to the calls, you can go and say, all right, here's all of our calls that we've done inside of capital markets, and here's the way that people interact, and here's the way that they engage. So it's much easier from that perspective to have that analytics, to have that insight, to have that perspective and engage. Again, we've touched on this a couple of times, like what is good? What is success?
Sure.
So, to pull it back together, if we're going to go, we're going to build in the US and we're going to build the US market. We say the US is our market. You are setting yourself up for failure, right? We want to focus in the US on this particular industry, and that's where we want to go. And that's why we want to be there. We want to go in the US for semiconductors. I would say, no, you go to South Korea, right? The semiconductor market in the US is not what it used to be, but there's a lot more in terms of consumer product goods companies here. There's a lot of high tech companies inside here. So if you don't have that name down and you don't have that defined, you tell someone to focus on California because it's high tech, you miss a lot of Austin, Texas. You miss a lot of New England. You miss a lot of Florida. You miss a lot in terms of the mid-Atlantic around Virginia. So, if you have that nailed down, you say, here's your list of accounts and here's your targets and here's the expectations and here's where you go through and here's how we can measure it. I believe it resolves all of that. And then when you get to the size of scale of company, where now you're almost running out of that and you're expanding, you can see horizontal out of that, right? So we're going to do JP Morgan Chase, which is personal investing. We're going to do JP Morgan asset management. We're going to do JP Morgan wealth management. Then you can get into deeper around, all right, here's what we're going to do in terms of geography, right? But most companies are not that big, and most companies don't have that scale. And most companies, quite frankly, don't have solutions that even would transcend all of that, right?
Yeah.
The handful of companies that go and would sell seats to everyone and expand everyone are very limited in terms of that space these days. So, if you don't define what is good and how you're going to measure people, I don't care what conversation we're having, you're not going to set them up for success around there.
Yeah,
And that's why I liked the name account model
sure.
inside of there, because it drives that behavior.
Yeah, I don't think I could have ever dreamt of a more complete answer. Hearing your brain and the amount of knowledge that you have in there is just incredible. And it makes me think that anyone that's watching this and thinking, well, maybe we could get Bradley Fractional, is probably going, actually, maybe we could just get him full time. And it covers what you said originally. I know, right? Exactly. But it's true, isn't it? Because like fractional people, the big difference, and I posted a very old Steve Jobs video the other day about the difference between consultants and well, his pain with consultants, and it's about the fact that they build these plans, but then when they go into the heat of battle, they fail, and the consultants nowhere to be seen. Whereas a fractional has that execution focus, and they love to go and build those things. So you can get a huge amount of results from a fractional person, but actually, there's so much complexity to it. And it's the first thing you said. Hire them, set them up, and then let them get on with it. And it reminds me of a book called Who Not How by Daniel Sullivan, who's a global strategic coach. And it's all about that exact message, which is the worst thing in the world, based on everything you've said, would be hire someone and then tell them what to do, because they have all of the knowledge. And if you're setting them up with your systems, your outcomes, your way of measuring success, all these things, then it's going to fail. Because not only are you trying to do something that won't work, you're actually limiting that person in terms of what they can bring. So you don't want to hire a junior and then tell them what to do. You need that challenger. You need someone to come in and say, hey, what about this? What about this? What about this? What about this? We've got all these things we could do, but let's rule out the 97 things that would be a terrible use of our time and focus on these 2 things that are going to get us further down the track, give us a bit of runway, and then go from there. So I think the who, not how approach is the exact right model for the US, because you want to hire in the expertise that knows how to make it work. And more importantly, can see all the blooming icebergs, because there's a hell of a lot of them, right?
No, it is. I mean, and it's so spot on. When I was at Risk Methods, a German-based company, the structure we had in the United States was really completely different than what my peer Kai had in Germany. And we were both successful, but we were successful different. And I was fortunate enough to have a great relationship with Heiko, who was one of the co-founders and CEO, where we were hitting what we needed to hit, and in a different way, and that was fine. So the way that I ran CS, the way that I actually completely eliminated the SDR team and sort of built them up a little bit, our AE structure, our sales engineers, all of that was completely different. It would look like a different company than what Kai did in Germany, but he was successful and I was successful, right? And I believe, and I look at that and say, there's a model there, but it takes a lot of trust.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of maturity, and it takes a lot of buy-in from the board and the rest of the organization to be comfortable with that, right? So I would work directly hand in hand in marketing out of the Boston office, even though they reported to the CMO in Germany. But he and I were aligned in terms of what needed to get done. And the marketing in the US was more field-based, so almost event marketing, where the marketing in Germany was, of course, the corporate marketing that was run out of there. And they were different. And the way that we looked at cost, the way that we looked at all those things was different. And I believe that allowed us to be successful, but not every company is going to be that way, right?
No,
in terms of that.
And I could easily imagine that someone listening to this might be thinking, well, there's so many things to get wrong, maybe we won't do it. But the upside of getting it right, like you talked about that one that maybe got away, is so high that if you can get the right who, then you're probably going to make it work. But there's this expectation piece, which you talked about. You had 2 separate things running beautifully, and it was seen as success. But then in your other example, 6 months later, bam, we're wrapping it up. Managing expectations, particularly of investors, if these are, VC-backed businesses, and that's why they're going to scale, because they've got some more fuel. What's your advice around managing expectations with investors so you don't get burned?
Early, often, and continuously, right? So I've been in many board meetings where I loved all of the board members that I've met with, but sometimes they'll even forget how your AE is structured, right? So it's very personal to us, meaning the revenue or marketing or whoever is at the board meeting. We're like, oh my God, but you have to also keep in mind that your board members are doing a gajillion other things, right? So you want to make sure that here's the plan that we're doing. You need to have just hard conviction we're doing it, right? You want input on it, the hard conviction. You want to keep them updated in terms of what the milestones are, and you want to remind them why you have those milestones in there as well. And then you want to be able to constantly engage with them, not every quarter in terms of what that is, but I'm a big proponent of updating them, middle and interim as well. And then ultimately, I think one of the things that boards bring on board is that advice and that visibility. So I would say leverage your board for introductions, for engagement. I mean, that's largely one of the things that they're there to help bring the board. So maybe you're dealing with one of the investors at Risk Methods, a private equity firm out of Germany. So maybe you have a PE firm in terms of where you're working there. And so I'm sure they have peer PE firms here in the United States. Can they make introductions inside of there? So the goal isn't that, we're making introductions in terms of finding more money or anything. Is that where you're looking for is introductions because maybe in their network, they've seen this, they've done this. We talked about partners. Maybe they have partners. So always assume that they don't know what's going on. And I don't mean that in a bad way, right? They just have 50 million things going on and you need to understand that. But get them bought in early on, get them to sign off on that, continually update them, educate them in terms of what you're doing, and make them part of both the problem and the solution around that.
Yeah.
Even if you do all that, it still may go awry. But that's part of what we get for playing in this arena, right? So even with the best of intentions, what is it, the road hills? The road hills paved with good intentions. So you can still do all of that, and that's fine, and that's okay. But you can't just say, we're going to go there and everything's going to be okay. And we're going to dump millions of dollars in that, because the first sign of pressure, that's going to be, can we cut these costs and can we reallocate them out of corporate, right?
Yeah.
And that'd be the death knell, because if you do, let's say you were moderately successful, whatever that is, we have 20 customers in the US and we do $1 million in AR, a $10 million a year company, that's 10% of your revenues. And then what are you going to do? You're just going to pull back and not support them? You're not going to get them back, right? And the cost to go back is going to be much more expensive inside there. And maybe there's an acquisition target, maybe you want to go to the US because you think you can get acquired better and faster, right? So doing it half-ass and pulling back, it's also not going to serve you well in the long term, right?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And obviously, the exciting of this podcast is, making the US successful, or mastering the American market without making an ass of it. So let's focus on that. We've talked a lot about how people might make an ass of it. What about some of the success stories? So, how many times have you been involved in these sorts of projects? And then what's gone really well? And then I was going to give you a second question, but I'll hold. What's gone really well in the examples that you personally experienced?
When I look back, there's been, I think 5 companies have done it. What they've done successful has been built out it's exactly what we talked about, Richard. It's a duplicate but different corporate structure in the United States. So you see a huge amount of overlap inside there. And the CRO role is a relatively new role. It used to be that the VPs were all rolled maybe to an operating officer or something like that, but you would see a VP in the US and then a VP in EMEA or a VP Asia Pac inside there. So I would encourage people that to bite the bullet, to build a duplicative structure inside the US. And that's where any companies, even when I go way back to when I was in business development, I worked in Mercury Interactive. Mercury Interactive was an Israeli company, right? But everything of it corporate wise was in the United States. If I look at autonomy, where I ran the OEM business, which was, when I left, we were $100 million run rate business. So, it wasn't small. That was UK. And then they built a corporate entity in the United States, right? So you see that time and time again, where the ones that do that successful have that relationship inside there. And I'm engaged in a couple of advisory roles right now where there's the toe in the water in the US and there's not the huge commitment, and what they're getting out of it is just their foot being wet, right? And they're not doing it. So to not make an ass out of yourself, whether it's personal relationships, professional, otherwise, you need to be all in and fully committed. And you can't go half-ass into it. If you go half-ass into it, you're going to get a half-ass results inside of it. Yeah. So, and you need to have a longer time horizon. And that's just not the US market. If I was building something in the US and I said, I'm going to go focus on continental Europe, I need to give myself a 2-3 year horizon around there in terms of building it. And my concern just mine that in its higher capital market that we're in right now, companies are either going to pull back and say we can't do that and can't do that investment, or they're going to half-ass the investment.
Sure.
Right. And then that doesn't serve anyone well inside there. And that's going to reflect negatively on your brand. It's going to reflect negatively on your investors, all those aspects on it.
Yeah.
So I know we've said a lot of the things that are similar,
Sure.
but it really is just strongly bears repeating inside there, right?
Yeah.
To go all in, build a duplicative structure. Or again, if you're not going to do all that, hire a couple really smart partner people, give them a great travel and entertainment budget, let them fly over here and do a bunch of things, and go find, if you sell security, go find, like SHI, and build a relationship and work those things and send them, Stanley tumbler water bottles and all that crap, and get them going, get them excited, and make sure there's great, co-marketing dollars, and you can do it. And that's a way that you can do it as well, right? It doesn't need to be this or that. But what I'm saying is you can't half-ass then the partner thing. You can't half-ass building your go-to-market here.
Yeah,
you
sure.
can't half-ass building your rev ops, your benefits, all of that. If you do, you're going to wind up getting where you're going to wind up with, right?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I'm just thinking in terms of wrapping this up, there's so many amazing things here. I think what we should do is turn this into some kind of report that people could have that would give them like a definitive guide of the sort of thing that they should consider to avoid making an ass of it. So everyone had that got live commitment on the call, which is fantastic. But let's say someone wanted to speak to you, Bradley. So someone's watching this and they're going, you just understand this at a different level and I really want to have a conversation with you. What's the best way of getting hold of you?
I think the easiest way is really going to LinkedIn. You can find me there. I'm open to connect with. Drop me a note. Helps if you reference this conversation, this podcast, or Richard and the folks at Tech Talent. Then I'll understand and I'll bump you up to the top of it. I do get a lot, as I think all of us do, a lot of spam inside there. But always open to have a conversation and chat with interesting people. I think it's hugely valuable, and I learn something as well from those interactions.
Yeah, sure. Okay, perfect. Well, I think hopefully your phone will be ringing off the hook. Amazing. Well, Bradley, thank you so much for your time. Meeting people like you through this sort of process that we have of doing the podcast is what it's all about for us, because finding great leaders who you would be able to, when you're talking to talent about the opportunities, knowing that they're going to be in safe hands, and that they're going to have a really good chance of being successful is what we dream of. So it's just a pleasure to have a conversation with someone with your experience, and he's just so grounded and down to earth and doesn't hype everything up. You're very like, right, here are the icebergs and here's how we can navigate them. By the way, we still might hit a few, and I really like that approach. So thank you so much for giving up your time today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Good man. Perfect. Well, thank you so much everyone for watching. Watch out for the report that we're going to release in the next couple of months, I would imagine. And until then, see you on the next episode.